Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Missouri Ozarks. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the winter months of 1908, a remote settlement in the heart of the Missouri Ozark Mountains became the center of events so profoundly disturbing that official records were systematically destroyed. Witness testimonies were suppressed by state and federal authorities, and the very land itself was eventually condemned and removed from public access. The small community known as St. Hollow, nestled in a limestone valley approximately 18 miles southwest of Eminence in Shannon County, Missouri, existed for barely 3 years before it ceased to exist entirely. What transpired within those years would challenge the understanding of seasoned investigators, medical professionals, and later academic researchers who attempted to piece together the fragmentary evidence that survived official erasure. The Ozark region in the early 20th century remained one of the most isolated and inaccessible areas of the continental United States. The mountains themselves, ancient erosion-sculpted highlands rising from the surrounding plains, created a labyrinth of steep valleys, dense hardwood forests, and vast underground cave systems formed over millions of years through the dissolution of limestone bedrock. Shannon County, where St. Hollow was located, contained terrain so rugged that many hollows and valleys remained unnamed and unmapped even decades after the events in question. The nearest substantial town, Eminence, could only be reached from St. Hollow by following a treacherous path that crossed 3 separate ridgelines and forded the current river at a rocky shallow that became impassable during spring floods or winter ice. In this landscape of profound isolation, communities developed their own distinct character, often shaped by the particular religious or social convictions of their founders. St. Hollow was established in the autumn of 1905 by a German immigrant named Friedrich Wilhelm Steinmetz, a man whose background would later be scrutinized with intense interest by investigators. According to land records filed with Shannon County on October 12, 1805, Steinmetz purchased 480 acres of heavily forested valley land for the sum of $600, a price that local land agents considered surprisingly generous, given the property's remoteness and the challenges of cultivation in such terrain. Steinmetz, who anglicized his name to Frederick William Steinman upon arriving in Missouri, was described in correspondence from the period as a man in his mid-50s, tall and powerfully built, with penetrating blue eyes and a thick gray beard that he wore in the old Germanic fashion. What made Steinman unusual among frontier settlers was his education. He had attended the University of Heidelberg in Germany, where he studied theology and, according to fragmentary records discovered much later, ancient languages including Hebrew, Aramaic, and what some sources suggest may have been Akkadian or another extinct Semitic language. He arrived in America in 1889, initially settling in Pennsylvania, before moving westward to Illinois, and finally to Missouri. His reasons for choosing such an isolated location became clearer when investigators examined his extensive personal library, which survived the events of 1908 and was cataloged by authorities before being classified and removed to unknown storage. The library contained over 300 volumes, an extraordinary collection for the frontier, including numerous theological texts, several extremely rare manuscripts dealing with what period newspapers would later describe as obscure religious practices, and a substantial collection of works on geology and speleology, the scientific study of caves. Steinman did not come to St. Hollow alone. With him came his wife, Margaret, a woman in her early 50s, described as quiet and devoted. His 3 adult children, 2 sons named Johann and Wilhelm, and a daughter named Katharina, and approximately 20 other German immigrant families who had joined Steinman's religious community while he lived in Illinois. According to testimony later provided by nearby settlers, Steinman had established what he called the Church of the Deeper Revelation, a Protestant denomination that emphasized direct spiritual experience and the study of what Steinman termed the original and uncorrupted Christianity that existed before the institutional church had, in his view, perverted the authentic teachings. The families who followed Steinman to St. Hollow were described as hard-working, pious, and intensely loyal to their pastor and teacher. The settlement they established was substantial for such a remote location. By the spring of 1906, the community had constructed 23 log cabins arranged in a rough semicircle around a central clearing, a sawmill powered by a substantial creek that flowed through the valley, a schoolhouse that also served as a temporary chapel, and, most significantly, a large church building constructed of hewn limestone blocks quarried from the surrounding hills. This church, which gave the settlement its name, stood at the northern end of the clearing, built against the base of a sheer limestone cliff that rose nearly 200 feet above the valley floor. According to descriptions from the few outsiders who visited St. Hollow before 1908, the church was an impressive structure, roughly 60 feet in length and 30 feet in width, with a steeply pitched roof and narrow windows, fitted with glass that Steinman had somehow transported to this remote location. The interior was spare but well crafted, with wooden pews that seated approximately 100 people and a raised pulpit carved from black walnut. What would prove most significant about the church's location was a feature that initially seemed merely practical. Directly behind the church, at the base of the limestone cliff, was the entrance to a cave system. Local geological surveys conducted decades later would determine that this cave system extended at least 7 miles into the surrounding mountains, descending to depths of more than 300 feet below the surface and containing multiple large chambers, underground streams, and connections to other cave systems in the region. Steinman had directed the church's construction so that a door in the rear wall of the building opened directly into the mouth of this cave. According to testimony from community members, Steinman explained this unusual architectural feature as providing a naturally cool space for food storage and a source of fresh water from the underground streams. He also, according to several accounts, spoke of the cave as a place of spiritual significance, though the exact nature of this significance would not become clear until much later. The community of St. Hollow existed in relative obscurity for its first 2 years. The families sustained themselves through subsistence farming in the cleared bottomlands along the creek, hunting in the surrounding forests, and limited trade with settlements closer to eminence. They were known to be insular, but not hostile to outsiders. A traveling preacher named Reverend Thomas Aldrich, who visited the settlement in July of 1906, wrote in his journal that he found the community to be orderly and the people sincere in their faith, though he noted that Steinman held theological views that diverged significantly from mainstream Protestant doctrine. Reverend Aldrich wrote that Steinman spoke at length about the importance of recovering ancient wisdom that had been deliberately hidden by religious authorities, and that he believed certain truths about the nature of divinity and the structure of spiritual reality had been preserved in texts that the church had condemned as heretical. The Reverend found these views unorthodox, but not particularly alarming, and he noted that the community seemed prosperous and content. The first indications that something had changed in St. Hollow appeared in the late autumn of 1907. A farmer named Cyrus Holcomb, whose property lay approximately 12 miles northeast of the settlement, encountered 3 members of the St. Hollow community at a general store in a small crossroads called Jadwin. Holcomb later testified to county authorities that the 3 men, whom he recognized from previous encounters, appeared markedly different from when he had last seen them some 6 months earlier. All 3 had lost considerable weight. Their faces were pallid and drawn, and they moved with what Holcomb described as a peculiar, shuffling gait. When Holcomb attempted to engage them in conversation, they responded in monosyllables and seemed anxious to conclude their business and depart. Most troubling to Holcomb was their eyes, which he described in his testimony as having taken on a strange quality, appearing somehow darker than he remembered and possessing what he called an intensity that was profoundly unsettling. Through the winter of 1907 and into the early months of 1908, similar reports began to accumulate. A mail carrier who serviced the remote settlements in that portion of Shannon County reported that the St. Hollow community had stopped collecting their mail, which consisted primarily of newspapers and occasional letters from relatives in other states. When he rode to the settlement in February of 1908 to inquire whether they still wished to receive postal service, he found the community present, but changed. He reported that the residents he encountered were reluctant to speak with him and seemed eager for him to leave. He noted that many of the buildings showed signs of neglect, with shutters hanging loose and pathways between cabins becoming overgrown, which struck him as highly unusual for a community that had previously maintained its properties with Germanic thoroughness. More disturbing were reports from individuals who lived within hearing distance of St. Hollow. Though given the acoustics of the mountains, hearing distance could mean several miles under certain atmospheric conditions. Beginning in March of 1908, residents of isolated cabins to the north and east of St. Hollow reported hearing sounds emanating from the valley, particularly during nighttime hours. These sounds were described variously as singing, though not of any recognizable hymn, chanting in what witnesses described as a foreign language, and, most unsettling, what several individuals characterized as screaming or wailing that would begin after dark and continue for hours. One witness, a widow named Mrs. Abigail Fletcher, who lived with her 2 teenage sons in a cabin approximately 4 miles from St. Hollow, kept a diary in which she recorded these occurrences. Her entry for March 23, 1908, reads in part, "The sounds from the hollow came again tonight, worse than before. It began shortly after sunset and continued past midnight. My boys are frightened and asked if we might go stay with my sister in Winona. But I cannot abandon our home on account of strange noises that may have natural explanations. Yet I confess that when the wind is right and those voices carry across the ridges, I feel a dread that I cannot adequately express in words." By April of 1908, concern about the St. Hollow community had grown sufficient that Sheriff Clayton Moss of Shannon County decided to investigate. Sheriff Moss, a practical man in his late 50s who had served in that capacity for 14 years, initially attributed the reports to the kind of superstition and exaggeration that was common among isolated rural populations. However, the accumulation of testimony from multiple reliable witnesses, including the mail carrier and Cyrus Holcomb, who was known as a level-headed and honest farmer, convinced him that an official inquiry was warranted. On April 16, 1908, Sheriff Moss, accompanied by his deputy, a man named Robert Crenshaw, and a local doctor named Jonathan Hayes, rode to St. Hollow to assess the situation. The report that Sheriff Moss filed upon his return provides the first official documentation of the conditions in the settlement. The report, which was discovered in 1947 when Shannon County Courthouse records were being reorganized following a fire, reads in part, arrived at the settlement known as St. Hollow at approximately 2 o'clock in the afternoon, found the community present, but observed numerous concerning conditions. Many of the residents appeared to be in poor health, exhibiting signs of malnutrition and exhaustion. Housing and infrastructure showing significant deterioration from conditions observed during previous visit in August of 1906. Residents were reluctant to answer questions and repeatedly deferred to their leader, Frederick Steinman, who met with us at the church building. Steinman claimed that the community had been engaged in a period of intensive religious observance involving fasting and nighttime prayer services, which he said accounted for the reports of sounds and the physical condition of the residents. He was adamant that no laws were being violated and that the community wished to be left alone to practice their faith without interference. Dr. Hayes examined several residents who consented and found evidence of malnutrition and sleep deprivation, but no signs of communicable disease or physical abuse. The community's children appeared particularly affected, being listless and unresponsive to attempts at engagement. Steinman refused to allow access to the church interior, claiming that it contained sacred materials that could not be viewed by outsiders. Given the absence of clear evidence of criminal activity, we concluded our investigation and departed, though I remained troubled by what I observed. Dr. Jonathan Hayes provided a supplementary statement that was more detailed in its medical observations. Hayes noted that of the 8 individuals he was able to examine, all showed similar physical symptoms: significant weight loss, muscular atrophy suggesting extended periods of minimal physical activity, pallor consistent with limited exposure to sunlight, and what he described as unusual neurological responses. He wrote, "When I attempted to test reflexes and visual responses, I observed abnormalities that I struggled to characterize adequately. Several subjects showed diminished pain response, requiring more forceful stimulus than normal to elicit reaction. Pupil responses to light were sluggish in some cases and entirely absent in one individual, a boy of perhaps 12 years, though he clearly possessed vision as he tracked movement with his eyes. Most disturbing was the affect displayed by those I examined. They showed no emotional response to my questions or my presence, staring with what I can only describe as an empty intensity that I have never encountered in 3 decades of medical practice." Sheriff Moss's report and Dr. Hayes's statement were filed with county authorities, and copies were sent to the state capitol in Jefferson City, as was standard procedure for reports of unusual circumstances. What should have triggered additional investigation instead seemed to disappear into bureaucratic channels. Later examination of state records found no evidence that any response was generated to Sheriff Moss's report. Whether this represented simple administrative oversight or something more deliberate remains a subject of speculation among researchers who have studied the St. Hollow case. Through late April and into May of 1908, The reports from the area surrounding St. Hollow intensified. Mrs. Fletcher's diary entries from this period document an escalation of the nighttime sounds, which she now described as occurring almost every night. Her entry for May 4th reads, "The sounds tonight were unlike anything I have heard before, not singing or chanting, but a kind of rhythmic vocalization that rose and fell in waves. My son Thomas said it reminded him of the sound the wind makes when it blows through the cave mouth up on Thunder Ridge, but there was something in it that was distinctly human, or perhaps I should say that it seemed to be human voices attempting to produce something that was not human. I find myself deeply unsettled and have written to my sister that we may indeed come to stay with her for a time." Other witnesses reported seeing lights in the valley at night, not the normal illumination of lamps or lanterns, but lights they described as having an unusual quality, appearing at times greenish or blue in color, and seeming to emanate from the ground itself near the church building. One witness, a young man named Daniel Pritchard, who had been hunting for ginseng in the forests surrounding St. Hollow, reported that he had approached to within half a mile of the settlement one evening in mid-May and had observed numerous figures moving in the clearing around the church. He stated that they appeared to be engaged in some kind of coordinated movement, circling the church building repeatedly, while the strange vocalizations echoed across the valley. He reported that the experience had frightened him sufficiently that he immediately withdrew and did not return to that area. What makes Pritchard's testimony particularly significant is his claim that during his observation he saw several of the figures enter the church through the front entrance and not emerge, while simultaneously other figures appeared to emerge from the ground near the rear of the church where the cave entrance was located, as if there were some kind of passage allowing circulation from the church through the cave system and back to the surface at a different point. This detail, which seemed almost fantastical when Pritchard reported it to county authorities in late May, would prove to have disturbing implications when the site was later examined. By early June of 1908, Sheriff Moss decided that a second investigation was necessary. The accumulation of reports, combined with the fact that no one from St. Hollow had been seen outside the settlement for nearly 2 months, created concern that the community might be in distress, or that Steinman might be exercising some kind of coercive control over his followers. On June 8th, Sheriff Moss returned to St. Hollow, this time accompanied by Deputy Crenshaw, Dr. Hayes, and 3 additional deputies recruited from neighboring counties to ensure sufficient force if the situation proved dangerous. What they found in St. Hollow on that June day would be described in multiple official reports, newspaper accounts, and later testimonies as something that defied rational explanation. The community was still present, but the deterioration observed in April had progressed to a shocking degree. The residents, numbering perhaps 70 individuals, including children, appeared to be in a state of extreme physical decline. Many could barely walk, moving with a shuffling gait that had been noted in earlier reports. Their skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and several appeared to have developed unusual growths or discolorations on their exposed skin that Dr. Hayes could not immediately identify. The children were in particularly distressing condition, many appearing to be in a state of semi-consciousness, their eyes open but unfocused. Sheriff Moss's official report from this visit, which was filed on June 10th and which later became a subject of intense controversy, describes the situation in stark terms. found the community of St. Hollow in conditions suggesting mass illness or poisoning. Residents are severely malnourished, and many appear to be suffering from some form of neurological impairment. Steinman again insisted that the community was engaged in religious practices and refused all offers of assistance. He claimed that what we were observing was a process of spiritual transformation that we could not understand. When I informed him that I intended to arrange for medical evacuation of the most severely affected individuals, particularly the children, he became agitated and stated that to interrupt the process at this stage would result in tragedy. He made several references to texts and prophecies that he claimed justified their practices. When pressed for details about what these practices entailed, he would only say that they had discovered something beneath the church in the deep caves that had granted them knowledge of how to transcend the limitations of physical existence. Dr. Hayes's supplementary medical report from this visit is even more disturbing in its clinical detail. He documented cases of what appeared to be advanced malnutrition, but with unusual characteristics that did not conform to standard presentations of starvation. He noted that while the subjects showed extreme weight loss and muscular atrophy, they did not display the edema and organ failure that would be expected at such advanced stages of malnutrition. More puzzling were the skin changes he observed, which he described as resembling fungal growths, but with an unusual crystalline quality that he had never encountered in any medical text. He attempted to collect samples from one individual, but Steinman and several other community members physically prevented him from doing so, though they did not employ violence, merely forming a barrier with their bodies that the doctor chose not to force through. Most significantly, Dr. Hayes reported that during his examination of the settlement, he observed that many residents appeared to be covered in a fine dust or powder that had a faintly luminescent quality in the shadows. When he questioned Steinman about this, the pastor responded that it was a natural substance found in the caves that had certain properties relevant to their spiritual practices. Hayes attempted to collect a sample of this powder from the ground near the church, but found that when exposed to direct sunlight, the substance seemed to rapidly deteriorate or evaporate, leaving no trace that could be preserved for analysis. Sheriff Moss concluded his June visit by informing Steinman that he would be returning with state authorities and that the community would need to accept outside assistance or face potential legal action for child endangerment. Steinman responded, according to the sheriff's report, by stating that such intervention would not be necessary, as the process they had undertaken would be complete within a matter of weeks, and the community would then demonstrate to the world what they had achieved. The sheriff and his party departed, and arrangements were made for representatives from the state health department to visit St. Hollow within 10 days. Those representatives never made their scheduled visit because on the morning of June 22, 1908, a massive structural collapse occurred in St. Hollow. The event was felt as seismic activity throughout the surrounding region, registering at the United States Geological Survey Station in St. Louis as an earthquake of approximately magnitude 4.2. Residents within 20 miles of St. Hollow reported hearing a tremendous roar that lasted for nearly a minute, followed by a ground shaking that caused objects to fall from shelves and, in some cases, caused minor structural damage to buildings. When Sheriff Moss and a hastily assembled group of county officials and volunteers arrived at St. Hollow on the afternoon of June 22nd, they found that the entire northern section of the settlement, including the church building, and approximately half of the residential structures had been swallowed by a massive sinkhole. The limestone cliff behind the church had collapsed, and the cave system beneath the settlement had apparently suffered a catastrophic failure that caused the ground to subside into the void below. The sinkhole was roughly 200 feet in diameter and of unknown depth, filled with broken rock, shattered timber, and clouds of dust that made visibility difficult. The scale of the disaster was immediately apparent. The church building had completely disappeared into the sinkhole, as had 11 of the residential cabins. The remaining structures in the southern portion of the settlement were severely damaged, with several showing large cracks in their foundations and walls. Most horrifying was the realization that an unknown number of people had been in the collapsed structures or in the cave system when the collapse occurred. Sheriff Moss's report from that day, written in obvious haste and shock, estimated that as many as 60 people might have been killed in the collapse. Rescue efforts began immediately, but were hampered by the instability of the ground surrounding the sinkhole. Engineers brought in from Rolla, where the School of Mines was located, assessed the situation and declared that further collapses were likely, and that it was too dangerous to attempt to descend into the sinkhole. Several volunteers ignored this advice and attempted to climb down into the debris field, hoping to find survivors. They reported that the sinkhole appeared to descend at least 100 feet and possibly much deeper, with the debris from the collapsed structures mixed with massive limestone boulders that had fallen from the surrounding walls. They heard no sounds that might indicate survivors, though the shifting of rock and the settling of debris made it difficult to be certain. Over the following 3 days, a handful of survivors were located in the southern portion of the settlement. These individuals, numbering 14 in total, were in a condition that Dr. Hayes, who had remained at the site to provide medical assistance, described as barely human. All were severely emaciated. Several were partially covered in the strange luminescent dust that Hayes had observed in his previous visit, and most were unable to communicate coherently. They were transported to a hospital in Rolla, where they remained under medical observation, and as later documents would reveal, under armed guard per orders that came from state authorities. It was during the rescue efforts on June 23rd that investigators made several discoveries that transformed the St. Hollow disaster from a tragic but natural catastrophe into something far more disturbing and mysterious. A group of rescuers exploring the less damaged residential structures found Frederick Steinman's personal library and papers relatively intact in his cabin, which stood at the extreme southern edge of the settlement and had suffered only minor damage. The books and manuscripts were immediately recognized as potentially important and were collected for examination by authorities. More significantly, one of the engineers from the School of Mines, a professor named Dr. Albert Whitcomb, discovered what appeared to be an alternative entrance to the cave system approximately 300 yards southwest of the main sinkhole. This entrance, a narrow crevice in an outcropping of limestone, was partially concealed by vegetation, but showed clear signs of recent human traffic, with the surrounding brush trampled and cleared. Dr. Whitcomb, accompanied by 2 students and Sheriff Moss, entered this passage with ropes and lamps to explore what they could of the cave system. Dr. Whitcomb's subsequent report on this expedition, filed with the Missouri Geological Survey on July 2, 1908, provides details that were considered so disturbing that the report was classified by state authorities shortly after its submission and did not become public until portions were released under pressure from researchers in the 1970s. The report describes an extensive cave system with multiple large chambers connected by narrow passages. Approximately 200 feet into the system, the explorers discovered the first of what Dr. Whitcomb termed anomalies. On the walls and ceilings of the cave passages, they observed extensive patches of a pale, luminescent growth that Dr. Whitcomb initially believed to be a species of bioluminescent fungus. However, closer examination revealed that the growth had characteristics that did not conform to any fungal species Dr. Whitcomb was familiar with. He described it as having a crystalline structure in addition to organic components, and noted that it seemed to pulse very slowly with light, brightening and dimming in a regular cycle that he timed at approximately one pulse every 40 seconds. Further into the cave system, in a large chamber that Dr. Whitcomb estimated to be roughly 80 feet in diameter and 40 feet in height, the explorers made a discovery that Dr. Whitcomb struggled to describe in scientific terms. The chamber contained what appeared to be deliberate arrangements of stones and artifacts, including primitive-looking carved objects that Dr. Whitcomb believed might be of Native American origin, though he acknowledged he was not an expert in such matters. More disturbing were signs that this chamber had been used extensively and recently by the St. Hollow community. The floor of the chamber was covered in the same luminescent growth found on the walls, but here it appeared to have been deliberately cultivated, forming patterns and designs that suggested intentional arrangement rather than natural growth. Most significantly, the chamber contained what Dr. Whitcomb described as altars or platforms constructed from limestone blocks, upon which rested objects that he could not immediately identify. These objects appeared to be partially organic and partially mineral, with a structure that suggested some kind of conglomerate of the luminescent growth material and other substances. Dr. Whitcomb attempted to collect samples, but found that when removed from the cave environment, the samples rapidly degraded, becoming inert and crumbling to dust within minutes of exposure to external air. He noted in his report that the atmosphere in the chamber had unusual qualities, being noticeably warmer than the surrounding passages and having an odor that he described as both mineral and organic, reminiscent of both limestone and decomposition, but with an additional component that was neither. The exploration of the cave system was cut short when, approximately 4 hours after entering, the group felt a tremor that indicated further instability in the geological structure. Dr. Whitcomb made the decision to evacuate immediately, and the group exited the cave without completing their survey. Dr. Whitcomb recommended in his report that further exploration be conducted, but only with extensive safety precautions and additional equipment. He also recommended that experts in biology and anthropology be consulted to examine the unusual growth and the artifacts found in the chamber. These recommendations were never followed. Within 48 hours of Dr. Whitcomb filing his report, representatives from the federal government arrived in Shannon County. According to later testimony from Sheriff Moss and others present at the time, these representatives identified themselves as being from the Department of the Interior and claimed authority over the site based on concerns about geological instability and public safety. They immediately cordoned off the entire St. Hollow area, establishing a perimeter that extended nearly a mile from the sinkhole and posting guards to prevent access. All materials collected from the site, including Steinman's library and papers and the samples collected by Dr. Whitcomb, were confiscated. The 14 survivors who had been taken to the hospital in Rolla were transferred to an undisclosed location, and their subsequent fate remains unknown despite numerous attempts by researchers to locate them or their descendants. Over the following months, the federal authorities conducted extensive work at the St. Hollow site, though the exact nature of this work was not disclosed to local officials. Witnesses reported seeing large amounts of material being transported away from the site, including what appeared to be excavated rock and soil. In September of 1908, the federal representatives announced that the site had been permanently sealed to prevent further collapses and protect public safety. Concrete was poured into the known cave entrances, and the entire area was declared off-limits. The land was eventually acquired through eminent domain proceedings by the federal government, with the stated purpose of preventing development in a geologically unstable area. The public record of the St. Hollow disaster, as reported in newspapers of the period, presented it as a straightforward, if tragic, incident of a sinkhole collapse that destroyed an isolated religious community. The Springfield Republican published an article on July 3, 1908, that described the disaster in factual terms but made no mention of the unusual circumstances described in the various official reports. The article stated that approximately 60 people were believed to have died in the collapse and that the community had been engaged in religious practices that involved prolonged fasting, which had left the residents in a weakened condition, unable to escape when the collapse occurred. The article concluded by noting that geological experts had determined the area was unsafe for habitation and that it would be permanently closed. However, fragments of the truth began to emerge through unofficial channels. Dr. Hayes, the physician who had examined the St. Hollow residents during the sheriff's visits and who had treated the survivors after the collapse, spoke privately with colleagues about his observations. One of these colleagues, a doctor at Washington University in St. Louis, named Dr. Michael Forster, documented Hayes's account in a private journal. Dr. Forster's journal, which was discovered among his papers after his death in 1941 and was subsequently studied by researchers, contains detailed descriptions that Hayes provided of the physical and neurological changes he observed in the St. Hollow residents. According to Dr. Forster's journal, Hayes believed that the St. Hollow community had been exposed to some kind of biological or chemical agent present in the cave system. Hayes described the luminescent growth that he had observed on the residents and in the settlement as having properties that suggested it might be capable of entering human tissue and inducing physiological changes. He speculated that prolonged exposure to this substance, possibly through inhalation of spores or physical contact, might account for the neurological symptoms and physical deterioration he had documented. However, Hayes also acknowledged that this explanation did not account for all of the phenomena he had observed, particularly the unusual luminescence of the substance and its apparent degradation when exposed to sunlight. More disturbing were Hayes's reports about the psychological state of the survivors he had examined after the collapse. He told Dr. Forster that several of the survivors, during brief periods of lucidity, had spoken about what they had experienced in St. Hollow during the months leading up to the collapse. They described Steinman as having become increasingly convinced that the cave system beneath the church contained what he called proof of an ancient wisdom that predated human civilization. According to these accounts, Steinman had found markings or texts in the deepest portions of the caves that he believed were instructions for a process of transformation that would allow human beings to transcend their physical limitations and access what he termed higher planes of existence. The survivors reported that Steinman had led the community in increasingly intense rituals in the cave chambers, involving prolonged exposure to the luminescent growth and consumption of substances derived from it. They described experiencing visions and sensations that they initially believed were spiritual revelations, but that progressively became more disturbing and alien. Several survivors spoke of losing sense of time and personal identity, of feeling as though their consciousness was expanding beyond the boundaries of their bodies, and of perceiving presences or entities within the caves that Steinman claimed were manifestations of the transcendent reality they were learning to access. Most troubling were the accounts that suggested not all members of the community had willingly participated in these practices. Several survivors indicated that as the rituals intensified, Steinman had become increasingly authoritarian, insisting that those who resisted were failing to overcome their earthly limitations and were jeopardizing the entire community's transformation. Some survivors reported that individuals who attempted to leave St. Hollow were prevented from doing so, though they described this prevention in ambiguous terms, suggesting that it was not physical restraint, but rather some kind of psychological compulsion or dependency that made departure impossible. Dr. Hayes's own fate adds another layer of mystery to the St. Hollow case. In late September of 1908, approximately 3 months after the disaster, Dr. Hayes was found dead in his home in Eminence under circumstances that the official record described as heart failure. However, according to testimony from his housekeeper and other acquaintances, Hayes had been in excellent health and had expressed no symptoms of cardiac problems. Moreover, in the days before his death, he had told several people that he was planning to publish an account of his observations at St. Hollow, and that he had retained copies of his medical notes despite having been ordered to surrender all materials to federal authorities. These retained notes were never found among his possessions after his death. The years following the St. Hollow disaster saw periodic attempts by journalists, researchers, and curiosity seekers to investigate what had actually occurred in that remote Ozark Valley. All such attempts were frustrated by the federal government's control of the site and the complete absence of official documentation. Requests for information filed with various government agencies produced either denials that any records existed or claims that records had been lost or destroyed. The land itself remained inaccessible, posted with signs warning of geological hazards and patrolled by guards who had authority to arrest trespassers. In 1924, a professor of anthropology from the University of Chicago, named Dr. Helena Strauss, became interested in the St. Hollow case after hearing second-hand accounts from colleagues in Missouri. Dr. Strauss had done extensive research on religious movements and alternative communities in America, and was intrigued by the fragments of information that had survived about Steinman's teachings and the community's practices. She spent 3 years attempting to gather information, interviewing elderly residents of Shannon County who remembered the disaster, examining newspaper archives, and filing numerous requests for access to government records. Dr. Strauss's research, which was never published in formal academic form, but exists as an unpublished manuscript in the archives of the University of Chicago, compiled testimony from 17 individuals who had some connection to the St. Hollow case. These included neighbors who had heard the nighttime sounds from the settlement, rescuers who had participated in the aftermath of the collapse and relatives of some of the community members who had died. Dr. Strauss also claimed to have located two of the survivors from the disaster, though she did not reveal their identities or locations in her manuscript, stating only that they were living under assumed names and feared government reprisal if they spoke publicly. According to Dr. Strauss's manuscript, these two survivors provided accounts that corroborated and expanded upon the fragmentary reports that had emerged through other sources. They described Steinman as having been initially a sincere, if unorthodox, religious teacher who genuinely believed he was leading his followers toward spiritual enlightenment. However, they claimed that after he discovered the luminescent growth in the deep caves and began to study its properties, his personality underwent a profound change. He became obsessed with the substance, spending days at a time in the caves and emerging with increasingly bizarre interpretations of religious texts that he claimed were now illuminated by the ancient knowledge he was accessing. The survivors described the substance itself as having powerful psychoactive properties when consumed or when its spores were inhaled in the enclosed environment of the cave chambers. They reported that initial exposure produced euphoric sensations and vivid hallucinations that seemed spiritual in nature. However, repeated exposure led to dependency and progressive physiological changes. They described feeling as though their bodies were becoming less solid, as though they were gradually merging with something larger and older than themselves. This sensation was initially interpreted as spiritual transcendence, but it became increasingly clear that it was accompanied by the deterioration of normal physical and mental functions. Most disturbing was the survivor's claim that Steinman had come to believe, based on his interpretation of the markings he found in the deepest portions of the caves, that the luminescent growth was not a natural biological phenomenon, but rather something that had been deliberately placed or cultivated in the caves by an ancient civilization that had achieved a form of existence beyond physical embodiment. Steinman believed that by integrating this substance into their own bodies, the St. Hollow community could achieve a similar transcendence, effectively abandoning their physical forms to become part of what he called the eternal consciousness that resided in the depths of the earth. The survivors reported that in the final weeks before the collapse, Steinman had announced that the process was nearly complete and that the community would soon undergo a final transformation that would free them from physical existence entirely. He claimed that this transformation would be accompanied by powerful energies that would reshape the physical structure around them, and he interpreted the increasing geological instability of the area as evidence that the transformation was imminent. The survivors who spoke to Dr. Strauss believed that Steinman had actually caused the collapse, either through some direct action or through the energies that his rituals were generating in the caves, though they acknowledged that this interpretation might have been influenced by their compromised mental state at the time. Dr. Strauss's manuscript concluded with her own analysis of the St. Hollow case. She argued that while the community clearly experienced a genuine disaster rooted in geological instability and possible exposure to some kind of toxic substance in the caves, the interpretation that Steinman and his followers placed on their experiences was shaped by religious beliefs and psychological factors. She suggested that the luminescent growth might have been a species of fungus with psychoactive properties similar to better-known hallucinogenic fungi, and that the prolonged exposure, combined with the social dynamics of an isolated religious community had created a situation of mass delusion and psychological deterioration. However, she acknowledged that this explanation did not account for all of the reported phenomena, particularly the unusual physical changes that had been documented by Dr. Hayes and the apparent degradation of the substance when removed from the cave environment. Dr. Strauss attempted to publish her research in several academic journals, but was repeatedly rejected, with editors citing lack of verifiable sources and the sensitive nature of the subject matter. She died in 1939, and her manuscript remained in university archives, unknown to most researchers until it was discovered in the 1960s by a graduate student conducting research on alternative religious movements in America. The rediscovery of Dr. Strauss's manuscript in 1964 coincided with a period of renewed interest in unusual historical cases and government secrecy. Several researchers and journalists attempted to follow up on her work, filing new requests for information about St. Hollow under the newly enacted Freedom of Information Act. These requests were initially denied on grounds of national security, a classification that struck many observers as bizarre, given that the events in question had occurred more than 50 years earlier. However, persistent legal challenges eventually resulted in the partial declassification of some materials in 1973. The documents released in 1973 included portions of Dr. Whitcomb's Geological Survey report, excerpts from Sheriff Moss's reports with certain sections redacted, and a small number of photographs taken at the St. Hollow site after the collapse. These photographs showed the massive sinkhole and the damaged structures, but also included several images that appeared to show the interior of the cave chambers. One photograph in particular generated considerable attention. It showed a portion of a cave wall covered with the luminescent growth that had been described in earlier accounts, and the growth appeared to form patterns that some observers argued looked deliberate rather than random. However, the photograph quality was poor, and interpretations varied widely. Also included in the released documents was a brief report from an agency identified only as the Office of Scientific Intelligence, dated August 1908. This report confirmed that samples of the luminescent growth had been collected and analyzed, and it stated that the substance was determined to be a previously unknown species combining fungal and crystalline characteristics. The report noted that the substance appeared to have unusual electromagnetic properties and that it degraded rapidly when removed from its native environment. The report concluded that the site represented a potential hazard due to unknown biological and geological factors, and it recommended permanent closure and continued monitoring. No further details about the analysis were provided, and the identity of the scientists who conducted the analysis was redacted. The partial declassification of 1973 led to several expeditions to the St. Hollow area by journalists and amateur investigators. They found that the site remained under federal control, though the level of active monitoring had decreased over the decades. The area was overgrown with forest, and the main sinkhole was barely visible beneath vegetation and accumulated soil. Attempts to locate the alternative cave entrance that Dr. Whitcomb had used were unsuccessful, and it was presumed that it had been sealed with the other known entrances. However, several investigators reported finding concrete seals in various locations throughout the area, suggesting that more cave openings had been sealed than were mentioned in official reports. In 1978, a team of researchers from the Missouri Speleological Survey obtained permission to conduct a geological assessment of the broader cave system in the region surrounding St. Hollow, though they were explicitly forbidden from entering the closed area itself. Their survey, which used ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing technologies, revealed that the cave system in that portion of the Ozarks was far more extensive than had been previously documented, with interconnected passages extending for dozens of miles and multiple large chambers at various depths. The survey also detected several anomalies in the area of the former St. Hollow settlement, including what appeared to be voids or chambers beneath the sealed site that were larger than would be expected from natural cave formation. The researchers speculated that these might represent chambers that had been artificially expanded or modified, though without direct access. They could not confirm this hypothesis. More intriguing were measurements of electromagnetic and thermal anomalies in the vicinity of the sealed site. The survey equipment detected low-level electromagnetic emissions that appeared to originate from beneath the surface in the area where the church had stood. These emissions had no obvious natural explanation, though the researchers acknowledged that unusual mineral deposits or underground water flows might account for such readings. There were also slight temperature variations detected in certain areas, with some locations showing temperatures several degrees higher than the surrounding terrain, despite being at similar depths below the surface. The 1978 survey sparked renewed speculation about what might still exist beneath the sealed St. Hollow site. Some researchers argued that the complete sealing of the site suggested that something dangerous or valuable remained below, and that the federal government's continued interest indicated that the site held significance beyond simple geological hazards. Conspiracy theories proliferated, with some claiming that the St. Hollow community had discovered evidence of an ancient pre-human civilization, while others suggested that the luminescent growth was some kind of extraterrestrial organism. More conventional explanations focused on the possibility that the caves contained unknown mineral deposits or unique biological phenomena that the government wanted to study or protect from exploitation. In 1989, a journalist named Karen Whitmore published a book titled Secrets Beneath the Ozarks that included a substantial chapter on the St. Hollow case. Whitmore had conducted extensive research, interviewing numerous individuals, including some who claimed to be descendants of St. Hollow community members who had not been present at the settlement when the collapse occurred. These descendants provided family stories and documents that offered additional context about Steinman and the community. According to these accounts, Steinman had been involved in several esoteric religious groups in Germany before emigrating to America, and he had brought with him texts and manuscripts that he claimed contained ancient knowledge suppressed by mainstream religious institutions. Whitmore's book also presented testimony from a former federal employee who had worked in archival management and who claimed, under condition of anonymity, that extensive classified files on St. Hollow existed within government storage facilities. This individual stated that the files included detailed scientific analyses of the luminescent growth, autopsy reports on several St. Hollow victims whose remains had been recovered, and ongoing monitoring data from the sealed site. The source claimed that the classification level of these materials was extraordinarily high, comparable to documents dealing with nuclear weapons research, and that access was restricted to a very small number of individuals with special clearances. The publication of Whitmore's book generated enough public interest that congressional representatives from Missouri requested information about the St. Hollow site and the reasons for its continued classification. The response they received, documented in congressional records from 1990, stated that the site remained classified due to ongoing environmental and safety concerns, and that declassification was not possible at that time. The representatives were offered a classified briefing on the subject, which several accepted, though they were prohibited from publicly discussing what they learned. One representative, speaking anonymously to reporters, stated only that the situation was more complex than the public record suggested, and that legitimate reasons existed for the continued restrictions on information and access. In recent decades, the St. Hollow case has been largely forgotten outside of circles of researchers interested in unusual historical events and government secrecy. The site itself remains under federal control, now managed by the National Park Service as part of a larger wilderness preservation area, though the specific location of the former settlement is not marked on public maps. The broader area is popular with hikers and cave explorers, but the sealed site is in a restricted zone that is off limits to visitors. However, occasional reports continue to emerge from the region that echo elements of the original St. Hollow case. Local residents and park rangers have reported unusual luminescent phenomena in certain caves in the area, though these are typically attributed to known bioluminescent organisms or mineral fluorescence. There have been several incidents over the years of individuals becoming lost in cave systems and being found in states of confusion or disorientation, sometimes with symptoms that include hallucinations and memory loss. These cases are generally attributed to hypothermia, dehydration, or simply the psychological stress of being lost in darkness, but some researchers have noted similarities to the symptoms reported from St. Hollow. In 2007, a team of biologists studying extremophile organisms in cave systems discovered a species of fungus in caves approximately 15 miles from the former St. Hollow site that displayed unusual characteristics. The fungus exhibited bioluminescence under certain conditions and appeared to have an unusually complex genetic structure. The researchers published their findings in a scientific journal, noting that the organism might represent a unique evolutionary adaptation to the cave environment. However, when they attempted to collect additional samples for further study, they were informed that the area had been placed under temporary access restrictions due to unspecified environmental concerns. These restrictions remained in place for 2 years, and when access was finally restored, the researchers were unable to locate the fungus again at the original site. To this day, questions about St. Hollow remain unanswered. What was the true nature of the luminescent growth found in the caves? Did Steinman actually discover evidence of some kind of ancient knowledge or civilization, or was he simply delusional, experiencing hallucinations induced by toxic exposure? What happened to the 14 survivors who were taken into custody after the collapse, and why were their fates never publicly documented? What exactly is contained in the classified files that apparently still exist in government archives? And perhaps, most significantly, what continues to exist beneath the sealed surface of the former settlement, such that, more than a century later, the federal government maintains control of the site and continues to restrict access and information. The St. Hollow case stands as one of the most thoroughly suppressed incidents in American history, a situation where the official record provides virtually no information, while fragmentary, unofficial sources hint at events that challenge conventional understanding. Whether the suppression represents a cover-up of government malfeasance, protection of genuinely dangerous biological or geological phenomena, or simply bureaucratic inertia, maintaining classifications that are no longer relevant remains a matter of speculation. What is certain is that in the early summer of 1908, something occurred in a remote Ozark valley that authorities determined must be hidden from public knowledge, and that determination has persisted across more than 10 decades and multiple generations of government officials. The families who followed Frederick Steinman to St. Hollow sought spiritual enlightenment and a community built on shared faith. What they found in the depths beneath their church remains one of the most disturbing mysteries in the history of the Missouri Ozarks, a secret that was deemed too dangerous or too inexplicable to be allowed into the historical record, and that therefore exists only in fragments, whispers, and documents that most researchers believe still remain sealed in archives, waiting for a time when the truth, whatever it might be, can finally be revealed.